I hadn't heard my daughter's voice in 10 years, just the echo of the last thing she ever said to me, "You made Mom suffer enough." That sentence turned holidays into empty chairs and letters into boomerangs. Then the headline said I'd sold my company and my phone finally rang, not for forgiveness, but for a favor dressed up as Christmas. One invitation, one smiling host, and a pledge that wasn't about family at all. I brought a different kind of gift, the kind that doesn't pay for love but pays attention to the truth, and the night cracked wide open. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, whether it's powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp of that scene and share your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate with you the most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. Dawn draped Elliott Bay in a pewter glaze as I stepped onto the dock, breath fuming, boots knocking a rhythm I have kept for 30 years. Gulls stitched the air with rough thread, and the port woke the way big animals do. First a tremor, then a groan. Second chance, my small boat nudged her bumpers like a dog nosing the door. I answered with the rituals that make a morning hold: check the bilge, crack the seacock, test the nav lights, run a palm along the rail until the varnish squeaked under my glove. Ray from the next slip called, "You still baby that cleat, Tom?" I said, "Yeah, baby's me back." He grinned into his scarf. "Heard about the sale." I told him, "Paperwork, not fireworks." We let the cold talk for us a minute and went back to our chores. People like to imagine a sale changes you in a trumpet blast. Mine came like tide. North Spire Marine, born in a garage that smelled of diesel and coffee, became a company because stubbornness outlived doubt. We read currents the way farmers read clouds, turned saltwater into data, and one gray morning a Norwegian conglomerate signed on the dotted line. Lawyers smiled, bankers clicked, and the wire slid across the world as quietly as fog. That night I stacked the same chipped bowls in the same sink and ate chowder alone. Wealth did not make the house larger so much as it made the silences taller. The enamel kettle rattled when steam bullied its lid. Sundays I stirred soup for dockhands who still tease me about the prototype that caught a wave wrong and threw itself to pieces. They dragged the story out, and I let them. Familiar friction keeps the hull honest. Lila's name finds its way into the room some evenings in the polite hush before the lamp clicks off. We were younger than our problems and thought love could outrun debt. Brent Calder had a wider smile and a shorter memory. Napa was sunlit, yes, but the brightness stung. Papers turned us into signatures faster than either of us expected. I don't tell that story on the dock. The ending is public. Bottles, vineyards, a house with views, a man who never patches his coat. Money, replace what you can reach, don't over-torque apologies. On mornings like this, I let the boat idle and listen to the harbor rehearse. Ferries shouldered across the bay like moving apartment buildings. Coffee bit the tongue and told the truth. If work had once been a storm that scattered my attention, routine had become a seawall. I test its stones by polishing the stainless cleat until it mirrors the sky. You could call that pointless. I call it prayer. There is irony in becoming solvent at the exact moment you realize nothing can purchase a voice that has chosen not to speak. The rooms carry that weight even when the bank account forgets it. I leave lights off in the spare bedroom. I park in the same spot. The neighbors think I am frugal. I am, though, not for their reasons. I keep a line in the journal boxed in ink like a warning buoy. If Ava calls, do not talk about money. Not insurance policies, not sales, not numbers that masquerade as love. I have rehearsed saying, "I'm proud of you," because pride is a language that doesn't need a receipt. I have practiced "I'm sorry" in sentences that do not beg for return mail. Contrition is not a coupon. Gulls cinched another knot in the morning. I stowed the fenders, shut down, and tied the bowline in a figure eight I could do asleep. The harbor skiff purred past and the pilot raised 2 fingers. I raised 2 back. Weather holds men together more faithfully than belief. If the forecast lies to you both, you share the joke. Back up the ramp, the city smelled like rain and brakes. I let myself into the house, left my boots on the mat, and set the kettle on. The drawer with the letters slid open and closed without my hand. That's how memory moves now. I do not fight it. I pour coffee, sit at the scarred table, and polish my glasses with the hem of a dish towel. The cleat on the boat gleamed in my mind's eye, small, bright, doing its only job, keeping what matters from drifting. The kettle clicked off and the small kitchen became so quiet I could hear the clock's second hand tapping the drywall. An unknown number showed on the phone, the kind I usually let pass into the long grass of voicemail. I answered anyway. The first breath on the other end carried a little tremor, the way her voice used to sound before a middle school solo. "Dad?" It cut straight through the years, struck bone, and then hung there, waiting to see if the structure would hold. I said her name once, careful not to crowd it with anything else. She described the plan in Napa. Christmas Eve at Brent's place on the hill, a catered thing, a tree big enough to require scaffolding. She said Leo, her fiancé, wanted to meet me. She used the word family like it might bruise if held too hard. I let her words settle, then told her I would come. After a pause long enough to hear ice shift in a glass, I said, "I'm bringing a gift. It isn't money." She exhaled a syllable that wanted to be a laugh, and wasn't. When the call ended, the kitchen regained its shape. The windows wore a skin of condensation, and the bay outside was a sheet of tin. I took the key from the hook inside the pantry and opened the small safe set into the floor. The binder came out heavy with tabs, charcoal gray, no flourish, labeled with the quiet logic that kept boats and people afloat. Governance, reporting, beneficiaries, disbursement schedule. The Evelyn Harlow Scholarship Fund was not a flourish either. It was a long bolt tightened to specification. Fishing families in Seattle, Monterey, and along the Gulf Current would have a ladder into ocean science. The fund's endowment would keep the ladder from wobbling. Quarterly reports would live online where anyone could read them without signing a petition or attending a gala. It was a promise to the woman who taught me soup as a love language and tides as a map. A new text chimed while I slid the binder back into its slot. Brent, efficient even in his punctuation. A link to a guest list with headshots, notes on valet hours, smart casual in italics, and a tasteful map of how to approach the drive without blocking the vineyard access. I saved the link and took a breath that tasted of metal and coffee. Behind his bullet points, the choreography glittered, cameras, pledges, applause lines. The invitation had not included the word ask, but it had threaded itself through every syllable like a wire. The fog lifted over Elliott Bay as if someone had turned a dimmer, edges of cranes and ferry rails defining themselves. I shaved down to the grain, nicked the spot that always bleeds, and mended the loose cuff on my blazer instead of buying a new one. Money, when it came late, had to be trained like a large dog, firm voice, consistent hand. I chose a plain white shirt, polished the old boots that had seen diesel and rain, and practiced not looking like I was practicing anything. I kept hearing the way Ava's first dad had hovered, full of trial and error, and how it steadied once she heard my voice come back clean. At the table, I drafted a note I might never hand her. Not an apology to be exchanged for something, not a ledger entry. I wrote about the first time she told a joke that made me spit coffee, about the smell of her hair after swim practice, about a summer afternoon when a seal surfaced off Alki and we followed it along the shore like pilgrims. I kept my pen away from money and from my anger's need to make exhibits of the past. I folded the page once, slipped it into an envelope without her name, and placed it in the satchel with my boarding pass and a pocket knife. I would forget to move to checked luggage and then remember at security. The city's noises shifted toward lunch, forklift backups, a bus sighing at the curb. I stood at the sink and watched a ferry muscle itself into place like a building changing neighborhood. It is a strange feeling to be grateful for a phone call that does not forgive you. The heart wants clean lines, the world sketches with a blunt pencil. I placed my hand flat on the counter to remind my body this was not a courtroom and no one had asked for closing statements. On the dock that afternoon, Ray asked if I'd be around for Christmas. I told him I'd be out of town, and he said he'd keep an eye on Second Chance, then added a joke about her getting ideas above her station. The laugh landed where it needed to. I double-checked the shore power and wiped down the cleat until the sky returned in it like a patient face. When I turned to leave, the slip looked like it always had, and not at all. Back upstairs, I wrote in the journal, "Offer a bridge, not a blank check." The letters came out steadier than I felt. The older I get, the more I suspect that dignity is just the habit of doing the next correct small thing. I labeled a folder for the travel receipts I didn't need to keep and set it by the door anyway. I laid out 2 photographs on the table, my mother with a ladle, Ava at 6 with her mouth full of bread, and looked from one to the other until they stopped being photographs and turned back into rooms I had stood inside. Dusk arrived early, as it does near the solstice, pulling the color out of the street until only taillights and the deli's neon held aglow. I placed the satchel by the door, switched off the yellow lamp that has followed me from rental to rental, and stood for a minute in the quiet. If this was a test, it wasn't the kind with a grade. It was the kind where you only learn afterward which muscle you have been training. I don't know what Ava had been told about me these 10 years or what she had told herself to keep the silence from making a noise. But I knew what I would take with me, a binder built like a keel, an envelope addressed to nobody, and a sentence rehearsed enough to sound unpracticed. I'm bringing a gift. It isn't money. 2 days later, the phone trilled with Lila's name, a sound I had taught the house to ignore. I answered because a man should take his own measurements before strangers do. She opened with a warm-up about logistics and then slid toward the point the way a wine glass slides on a too smooth tray. The Seaward Foundation, she said, was doing something extraordinary for the ocean, a pilot program with classrooms and underwater drones. If I could make a pledge of honor $500,000, it would unlock a matching grant. She called it timing. I called it choreography. I asked for a prospectus, the 2 most recent 990s, and an auditor's letter. A beat of cheerful static. "Brent can walk you through at dinner," she said, and I could hear her smile working hard. A few minutes later, a private text arrived from Leo. He led with empathy, pivoted to amplification. If I lent my name, he could secure coverage. My credibility would halo seaward, the gift would be story-rich. I wrote back asking for audited financials and board disclosures. He replied with a glossy brochure whose photography glowed like a shampoo ad. The copy promised a lot of healing and almost no numbers. Nonprofits need poetry too, but poetry without math is a faith heal. I set the brochure beside my coffee and opened the laptop. Seaward's website read like a template bought in a hurry. Contact addresses shuffled between pages. Staff bios stacked titles over vapor. The domain registration pointed to a privacy shield in Arizona, not a sin but not a hymn either. I noted the details the way a mechanic notes heat where there shouldn't be heat. I went looking for something else entirely, old insurance paperwork, and found the box with my mother's effects. In it, a thin folder with a Tacoma Antique Shop's receipt, 8 years old, for a bulk purchase of porcelain. I remembered the day only as a sudden absence in the kitchen. The signature line for the seller carried initials that bristled the back of my neck, A.H. I called the shop and expected a disconnected number. A new owner answered, and after a polite rummage through the digital attic, emailed a scan, itemized pieces, date, and a photocopy of a Pier Proxy letter authorizing liquidation during illness. The signature at the bottom claimed my mother's name in a hand that looked like mine, trying not to be mine. The date claimed a day 6 months after her body was lowered into the earth in rain that never let up. Even on a screen, the ink felt like a bruise you can't admit to anyone because you can't explain how it got there. I printed it and held the paper by its edges like something worked loose from a wreck. The anger didn't come as fire. It arrived as a draft under a door, the kind that keeps you awake because it won't. I thought about the porcelain bowl that sang when a spoon touched it, the one my mother believed made soup taste truer. An object is only an object until it isn't. I imagined the counter emptied, the cabinet breathing cold air where plates had been, and I pictured a young woman at a counter lying to a man she did not know about a grandmother he would never meet. If I had been there, I would have said nothing useful. I forwarded the scans to Mackie, an attorney I trust, because she starts sentences with, "Here's what we know," not, "Here's what we can get away with." Her reply came the way good replies do, fast, careful. She flagged the notary block as odd, the font misaligned, the seal impression shallow. She asked for the death certificate. I scanned it and pressed send. She wrote that she would fly to Napa and meet me before the party. Our plan would be dull by design, document, verify, do not perform. I booked a seat on a Seattle-Oakland flight that would land me in the afternoon light Napa likes to sell postcards of. I emailed public record requests for Seward's filings to the California Attorney General's Charity Registry. I texted Ray at the port and asked if he could map any LLCS orbiting Brent. Within an hour, he pinged back a screenshot that looked like a knot of eels. Shared addresses, managers in rotation, small tax flags waving in little red triangles. He wrote, "Smells like wet drywall." That night, I called Ava and asked if we could meet for coffee before the event. Just the two of us, no speeches. She said the week was a circus and Brent is transparent. The sentence slid like something read off a teleprompter. I told her about the scholarship fund named for her grandmother and how we would report every quarter without fail. She bristled, said she didn't want to be morally cornered. The word stung more because some part of it was fair. I told her I did not intend to corner anyone. We hung up with a thin line stretched between us, taut, unmeasured. I packed with the discipline of habit, the blazer, the good boots, the satchel with a new folder labeled Proof. I slipped in a photo of my mother bent over a pot and a note that read in block letters, "Do not argue what you can show." On the last page of the journal, I wrote a sentence I wanted to resist. The people we love can be the ones who teach us how to speak plainly. I closed the book, set it by the door, and turned off the light. Proof would go on the table. The rest could wait. Mackie met me at a narrow coffee bar off First Avenue where the grinder sounded like gravel under a tire. Navy blazer, flat shoes, legal pad already open. She worked in straight lines. I slid the folder across. Our plan drew itself with the ease of muscle memory. Document first, disclose later. 2 lanes. One tracked seaward, 1990s, state charity registrations, board rosters, addresses, any hint of self-dealing. The other traced the forged proxy, death record, notary log, and the chain of custody for the antique sale that had quietly emptied my mother's kitchen. Nothing dramatic, just enough paper to let the facts stand on their own legs. From the window, harbor cranes raised their slow arms like parishioners. Ray texted a rough constellation of Brent's LLCS. Recycled addresses, managers rotating like tires, a property trust name to sound like weather, small tax flags blinked along the edges. Not illegal by itself, Mackie said, scanning, but if Seward's cash kisses these shells, someone's skating. She wrote 3 words on the pad, flow, control, benefit, and boxed them like a stop sign. I recognized the comfort of systems, torque specs for people who sign things. I emailed Ava asking for 20 minutes alone before the party. The reply came fast. "This week is stacked." Brent's transparent. I deleted 3 drafts and sent only, "I want to see you, not a schedule." No answer. I walked the waterfront to keep from rehearsing arguments I didn't want to perform, watched gulls argue over a heel of bread as if it mattered more than the tide. When I got home, I wrote myself a mechanic's checklist in block capitals. Do not ask why. Ask who signed, who witnessed, who notarized. Do not accuse. Present. Do not negotiate memory. Offer the document. If the engine knocks, idle. Truth hates revs. I taped the sheet inside the satchel like a placard behind glass. Mackie's next email arrived before dawn. The notary named on the proxy had let her commission lapse the year before the supposed stamp. If a bound ledger existed, it would be boxed in a strip mall storage south of Tacoma. "We'll take copies, not originals," she wrote. "We'll keep our voices level." I answered with a word I rarely use. Thanks. Outside, the bay wore a lid of pewter, and the ferries moved like patients returning to their rooms. By mid-morning, the port smelled of rain and diesel and a reefer truck's faint orange. Ray caught my sleeve and tapped his diagram. "Your guy's playing musical chairs." I said, "Or musical names." He frowned. "You sure you want a Christmas like this?" "I want a Christmas that doesn't lie about itself." He looked at me with the helpless kindness of a man who can lift a crate but not a life, then went back to coiling line. The world keeps working even when you would rather it pause. The strip mall sat between a locksmith and a payday lender, winter light bleaching the paint to chalk. The storage manager brought the notary's box like a relic from a quieter century. We unbuckled the ledger straps and turned pages that smelled of paperbacks and damp. For 6 months around the proxy date, signatures marched in tidy columns. Our day was a gap bridged by a margin note, office flood. Nearby stamps bit deep into the paper, round and proud. Ours did not exist. Mackie photographed the context, not the ghost. "Absence can be evidence," she said, "if you can show the footprints leading to the hole." It was not courtroom thunder. It was the quiet of a room after someone admits what everyone already knows. Back in Seattle, I ironed my blazer and divided the kitchen table into 2 weather systems. On the left, seaward, registry printout showing no filings for 2 years, a screenshot of its mailing address sharing a wall with one of Brent's shells, board names that looped back to his partners like a mirrored hallway. On the right, the proxy stack, death certificate, notary commission record, ledger images, the antique receipt with my daughter's initials. I labeled them heat and fact, then swapped the cards because both piles carried both temperatures. I was not building a trap. I was laying out a diagram any honest person could read. I called Ava and reached the same bright voicemail I'd known when she was 10, the one that rose at the end like a hand asking to be called on. "I'll be there at 6, I said. "I'm bringing a gift that isn't money." I did not say proof. I did not say betrayal. I kept the message short. Long messages try to do the work, words can't. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my palm until the warmth left it and the room resumed its old temperature. Packing took 10 minutes. Satchel, binder, envelope, photo of my mother with the ladle. I added a fountain pen because it slows me down, and slowness is a form of honesty. At the door, I checked the lamp, the stove, the shore power breaker, then stood still until the quiet settled into a shape I could carry. I have learned to leave rooms the way I arrive, without making the furniture nervous. The flight out of SeaTac lifted through a lid of cloud and found a seam of sun over gray water stitched with fairy wakes. Seattle shrank into a puzzle of roofs and cranes, and then into nothing I could name. I opened the journal and printed a sentence I wanted to earn rather than say, "Forgiveness is downstream of truth." It landed on the page like a weight finally set in the correct place. I closed the cover and let the engines do the talking. California would be bright and performative. I would be neither. I am a man built by tide tables and torque specs. The work ahead would move like tide, indifferent to lighting cues, faithful to the moon, and patient enough to pry a harbor open without raising its voice. The road up to Brent's winery switched back through winter vines the color of old rope, the hills washed in a kind of gold that flatters everything except the truth. Strings of bulbs draped the stone facade like a promise. The valet line moved with the hush of a place where money has trained friction to keep its voice down. Inside, the heat smelled faintly of cinnamon and oak, and a tree so large it might have been engineered stood beneath a skylight, its needles catching light like sequins. A stage had been pressed into one end of the barrel room, a pledge thermometer projected behind it, inch marks waiting for names. When I checked my coat, the attendant wrote my last name with careful capital letters as if spelling could bless the night. Brent found me with a glass lifted at the exact height a camera would like. His tuxedo fit the way rehearsed lines do. He said the word innovator as though it were a title you could pin above a pocket and tapped the microphone twice so the room would look at us. "A man who turned currents into knowledge," he said, and the crowd returned his sentence in a polite ripple. I nodded once, the way you nod at a tow line you don't plan to take. He leaned close enough that his aftershave erased the scent of oak. "We'll cue you near the top," he murmured. "Make it clean." I told him I needed 10 minutes somewhere quiet. He wrapped my shoulder with a hand on which the nails shone. "Of course," he said, and gestured me toward a side hall. Mackie was waiting in a small conference room with a view of a dark courtyard. She had a laptop open and a folder already fanned into lanes. The first held printouts from the state registry. Seaward had failed to file 990s for 2 consecutive years. The second showed a shared address with one of Brent's property shells. A third circled overlapping board names until the circles formed a single bruised ring. "No smoking gun," she said, "but the smoke is indoors." I placed my satchel on the table and slid out the proxy stack. She laid the death certificate beside the photocopied authorization, the dates sitting together like strangers forced to share a pew. The notary commission had lapsed before the stamp that claimed to be hers. "You don't have to use this tonight," Mackie said. "You only have to know it's real." The door opened and Ava stepped in, shoulders squared against the air. Brent followed 2 steps behind, smile welded. She looked from the papers to my hands. "Please don't make a scene," she said, and the word please wobbled like a glass carried too quickly. I told her quietly we could do this without a stage or not do it at all. I turned the proxy toward her. For a second, her face went blank in the way faces do before they choose which story will let them live with themselves. "Mom signed that," she said. I slid the death record an inch. The inch weighed more than either page. She swallowed. Brent began a warm paragraph about clerical errors, the holidays, the mission, the optics. It was a paragraph he had said before to other men in other rooms. A staffer popped in to say the program would begin in 5. Brent smoothed his cuff and asked if we were ready to make history. Ava watched me as if my answer might decide the shape of the rest of her life, which in a small way it might. I picked up the satchel. "I'll be brief," I said. Briefness is a mercy when a room is about to learn something it doesn't want to know. On the way to the stage, a man I didn't know touched my elbow and motioned me toward a corridor lined with barrels. Leo stood there, shoulders hunched, in a suit that had been bought for approval rather than fit. His voice landed in the tight space like something smuggled. "I need to tell you something." He spoke fast enough to outrun his nerve. A decade ago, Brent hired him to help manage a narrative. He and another junior built a whisper machine, blogs, comments, a seeded thread here and there that painted me as a man who chose work over family, as a stubbornness that had curdled into cruelty. "It wasn't a lot," he said, which is what men say when they finally hear themselves. He said he would turn over emails, screenshots, billing statements. He asked if there was a way to keep Ava from the worst of it if the legal weather turned. I told him I don't bargain with evidence and I don't trade daughters like chips. I said, "Do the right thing because it's right." He nodded once, not the nod of a deal, the nod of a man who finally knows the bill has come. The MC's voice ricocheted off the barrels as we returned. The thermometer glowed in reds and rose toward a mark where my name would look expensive. Brent announced me with a hand sweep that practiced magnanimity. The floor of the room felt as stable as a deck in easy weather. I looked for Ava in the crowd and found her half a step behind Brent's shoulder, arms crossed in the self-embrace of someone who has run out of places to put her hands. I took the mic and did not thank the adjectives. "Tonight is a good night to talk about what holds," I said. "Boats, families, promises, none of them stay up by accident. I let the room quiet without shaming it. I won't be pledging to Seaward." That sentence moved through the air slower than sentences usually move. "I will be endowing the Evelyn Harlow Scholarship, $5 million placed with an independent board, audited, with public quarterly reports. It will fund children from working water families in Seattle, Monterey, and the Gulf to study the ocean that feeds them." I added the part that needed to be a clean cut. "No funds will pass through tonight's host organization." The sound that followed wasn't boos and wasn't applause. It was the collective noise a room makes when it realizes its lines will not be needed. A camera light died mid-glow. Brent clapped twice because his body didn't know what else to do, and then stopped because the sound embarrassed him. The MC nodded rapidly as if nodding could land a plane. A donor near the front checked her watch like it could produce a different scene if consulted often enough. I set the mic gently on its rest. Mackie stood at the back with her arms folded in a posture that was not victory and not surrender. It was witness. As I stepped off the stage, Ava's face cracked along 3 fault lines at once. Alarm, anger, relief, none of them yet sturdy enough to stand on. Brent gave me a smile that contained teeth and nothing else. The thermometer projection dimmed until the wall was only stone. Outside the doors, night had dropped cleanly over the vineyard, the bulbs along the courtyard path burning with the brittle cheer of a party, surprised by weather. I had not raised my voice. I had not used the proxy. I had announced a bridge and declined a toll road. Somewhere in the building, a camera crew packed cables into a crate hard enough to bruise. I followed the exit sign toward air that didn't carry cinnamon and let the cold tell the truth the room could not. The night outside the barrel room felt colder than December had any right to be in Napa, a clean cold that washed the cinnamon and staged applause out of my lungs. Lights braided along the courtyard wall, making the stone look forgiving. It wasn't. I leaned on the rail, palm flat, and let my heartbeat come back to a human tempo. You don't lift a harbor gate all at once. You work the chains until the weight decides to move. Mackie joined me without speaking, the way a good pilot boat noses up without bumping paint. She stood there long enough for the silence to do its work, and then said the sentence she says when it's time to point the bow. We file first thing. I pictured the bundle as it would travel. Deficiency notices for 9/9s, address overlaps, board interlocks, the letter to the registry, the note to the county paper's watchdog desk that wouldn't sound like a drum roll. Not a storm, not a spectacle. Weather steady and cumulative. Inside, the program staggered on its new legs. I watched shadowed figures applaud something smaller than what they had come for and thought about how often people confuse size with truth. When the door opened again, Ava stepped through, closing it behind her as if a draft could undo what had been said. Her face carried the look of someone who has walked out of a theater after the fire alarm and keeps hearing the bell in their bones. She stopped 3 feet away as if there were tape on the ground, marking where she was allowed to stand. "You're punishing me with virtue," she said, the words quiet and sharp. I kept my voice in the lane I had chosen hours before. "I'm declining to pour into a leak." She looked past me at nothing and swallowed until the swallow landed. "You could have helped without making a point." I thought of the proxy letter, of ink pretending to be a hand that had already left this world. I thought of porcelain bowls boxed and priced by people who never knew the soup they held. "The point made itself," I said. She flinched, not at me, at the angle of the sentence. We stood there, 2 outlines that had not yet learned to share a page. My phone buzzed. An email from Leo arrived with a subject line no sensible man enjoys. Materials. Inside, a shared drive link and a bulleted inventory written in the tidy fear of a junior who wants to live to old age. Billing statements, content calendars, burner account seeds, a pitch deck titled with the kind of euphemism that makes decent people tired. He had attached a note smaller than apology and bigger than excuse. I forwarded the message to Mackie and watched her face settle into the geometry of action. "Chain of custody," she said. We'll mirror, hash, and park a set off-site." Ava hugged herself tighter against the wind she had made by opening the door. "What happens now?" she asked, and the question did not mean filings or interviews. It meant us. It always had. "Now we tell the truth where it belongs," I said, "and we wait to see who wants to stand in the same room with it." She nodded in a way that didn't agree and didn't defy, a movement that simply acknowledged that a sentence had been placed on the table where both of us could see it. Brent's laugh arrived before Brent did. It was a sound built for rooms, not people, and it bounced off the stone as if it had practice. He stepped into the cold and pretended to find it charming. "Quite an oration," he said, the word oration chosen because speech would have admitted to the size of the thing. I didn't answer. Some men receive silence as a border, others hear it as an invitation. He heard invitation. "You could have come to me," he said. "We could have found an arrangement that honored your preferences." He meant a corridor without windows. "I went to the ocean," I said. "She has a longer memory." He smiled the way a card dealer smiles at a man who keeps playing a losing hand and retreated into his warmth. We stood again in weather that did not care about our positions. For 10 years I had imagined this moment as a courtroom package: argument, rebuttal, verdict, relief. The real thing was smaller, more workable. I chose, and the night did not change color. A slow rightness separated itself from my ribs like a boat ungluing from a slip. Back inside, the tree glittered as if nothing could touch it. Donors found their coats with the speed of people who had suddenly remembered another engagement. The thermometer projection had been replaced by a slideshow of salt-sprayed children holding cardboard cutouts of fish. No one looked up at it for long. Mackie moved through the room with her compact gait, collecting what needed collecting, not counting the stairs. I signed a valet slip with the fountain pen that makes my hand behave, and passed a check to the bartender for the staff's end-of-night pool, an old habit that keeps me from thinking too hard about how rooms like this run. Before I left, I found a table no one needed and placed the sealed envelope I had written at my kitchen table in Seattle. No name on it, no request. It said a single thing plainly and without price: I missed you without trying to buy you back. If she found it, it would be hers. If she didn't, it would be mine. A promise kept to a future that may never arrive. I refused to write to ghosts. I wrote to a border that might one day open. In the car, I didn't turn on the radio. Headlights braided down the hill like a careful river. At the gate, I paused and looked back at the lit stone, at the small figures moving like punctuation marks in a sentence that had lost its verb. You don't win nights like this. You align them. You check the bolts and the lines, and you go home. I drove toward a motel off the highway where the ice machine rattled and the parking lot light buzzed, the sort of place where money stops showing off and lets you sleep. I set an alarm for early, wrote 3 words in the journal: file, mirror, breathe, and closed my eyes on a choice that would still be a choice in the morning and, if I was lucky, again the day after that. Morning spread over the motel parking lot like cold paint, and the ice machine coughed itself quiet. By the time the coffee was dark enough to pass for courage, Mackie had already filed the first packet. Deficiency notices, address overlaps, board interlocks, cross-referenced with the shells Ray mapped. She copied the county paper's watchdog desk and an assistant attorney general whose email signature read like a ruler. Our material didn't sing, it stacked. That was the point. Paper knows how to hold its own weight if you stop asking it to act. By noon, the room I carried in my pocket, the one made of glass and light, began to fill with small weather reports. A donor wrote to say she was reconsidering involvement, a phrase that flinches as it moves. The registry sent a sober receipt acknowledging our complaint. A reporter asked to confirm the spelling of my mother's name. None of it felt like triumph. It felt like Torquay settled to spec. Mackie drove us to the strip mall, storage south of Tacoma, where the notary's ledger slept in its cardboard cradle. We had been there the day before, but today the gaps read louder. Pages around our date marched with the cleanliness of habit: signatures, stamp impressions, the clean embedding of a circle in paper. Our day was a hole with a damp ring around it and a margin note from months later: office flood. Mackie photographed the context again the way you photograph shoreline before and after a storm to show the subtraction. Absence is not nothing, she said. It is shape. On the drive back, Leo's link populated itself with proof. Emails with Brent's clipped approvals, billing records labeled with euphemisms that knew what they were hiding, calendars with content drops timed to family holidays when attention would already be brittle. He had added a 2-sentence note that did not ask for absolution. I'm done lying for a living. I'll testify. It is strange how quickly a wire changes voltage when the current of a person's intention reverses. I got to Seattle at dusk. The bay had the color of old pewter and the ferries moved in patient diagonals. My phone lit with a text from Ava. Pier. Now? I walked the ramp down to the water with the sense that the city had tilted slightly to ease my steps. She stood by a piling with both hands jammed into her coat, hair pulled back like someone going into surgery. When she looked up, I saw not a child and not a stranger, but a person who had begun to understand that stories and facts are not sworn enemies. She started with the sentence people reach for when there's too much to say. I didn't mean for it to be like this. The wind carried the words a little before it let them land. I kept the rules I had written to myself. Don't ask why, ask names. Who told you to sign for what wasn't yours? She stared past my shoulder at the fairy lights. No one told me. I told myself it was fine, that Nana would want us to have the money. I was 24 and everything seemed like an emergency. She paused and then added the part that didn't fit inside any excuse. I knew she was already gone. There was no satisfaction in hearing it. The confession only laid the pieces out in a better light. Behind her, a goal hovered like a hanging question. I did not perform forgiveness. I let the truth find places to sit. What matters next is what we do with it, I said. There will be questions. Some of them will be from people who want answers more than headlines. She nodded, and the nod did not pretend to be peace. Her phone began to ring. Brent's name filled the screen like a warning. She watched it vibrate once, twice, 3 times, then turned the phone face down on the weathered plank. He says I'm weak when I don't defend the family. I said families worth defending don't need a PR budget. She gave a short, ugly laugh that broke into something softer and then stopped before it could become anything at all. We walked the length of the pier without touching. She told me about the 10 Thanksgivings that had organized themselves around a man who talked in bullet points, about the quiet afterward when the dishwasher's hum was the only truthful sound left in the house, about Leo's good intentions becoming bad habits because habit is what intentions become when you stop checking. I told her about the scholarship board, names she didn't recognize that would never owe me a favor, about the first class we meant to fund, about a boy in a photo from Biloxi grinning around a gap-toothed mouth, holding a mackerel like a trophy. I want to help, she said. The pronoun sat on the air like a bird deciding whether to land. Then start by telling the truth to someone who can use it, I said. Mackie will set the meeting. She nodded again, less like agreement, more like gravity doing what it does. And after, she asked. After we keep not talking about money, I said. The fairy horn reached us slow and low, the sound big enough to live in for a breath. We stood until our hands forgot to be cold. She picked up her phone and, without looking at it, powered it down. He'll be furious, she said. I said he already was. She put the phone in her pocket like a small stone and turned her face into the wind, eyes shut as if listening for something larger than either of us. When she opened them, the lights on the far shore had come into sharper focus. I'll call Mackie in the morning, she said. Tonight I'm going home. I did not ask where home was. I said, I'll be at the dock at 5 on Sunday. 5, she said, as if testing a note. I watched her walk off the pier without needing to steady herself on the rail. The bay went on being a bay. The gull found a thermal and rose. Somewhere back toward the highway, a siren stitched 2 blocks together and then unstitched them. I wrote one line in the journal before the ink cooled. Truth doesn't heal. Truth lets the wound drain so healing can start. Then I closed the book and let the city gather me back up, not as a hero and not as a ghost, just as a man who had finally stopped negotiating with silence. We met the deputy district attorney in a conference room that tried hard not to look like a conference room. Art prints with watery horizons, a pot of coffee that had already died once and been warmed back to life. Mackie set out the packets with the precision of a machinist. Seaward filings, address overlaps, board interlocks, ledger photos, the proxy, the antique receipt. Ava sat beside me, close enough that I could hear her breaths travel from nose to ribs, each one counting its way down. The deputy DA, a woman with gray threaded through her hair like salt in dark water, began with the questions that matter. Who signed, who witnessed, who benefited? Ava answered without embroidery. When the proxy's date came up against the death certificate's date, the room did not gasp. It adjusted its posture. Leo came in late with a banker's box and the look of a man who had finally decided which side of the table he belongs on. He slid the chain of custody letter across, then the mirrored drive. I can testify to authorship and direction, he said. No speech about growth or redemption. He let the nouns do their work. The deputy DA nodded once. "We'll be in touch," she said, which in that room sounded less like delay and more like warning. Outside, air tasted brighter than the sky looked. We walked 2 blocks without talking. When we stopped, it was in front of a glass storefront with painted letters that made a promise: Maritime Community Library. Inside, the room smelled of rope and paper. I spoke to the director about the porcelain we had managed to reacquire from the antique circuit. 3 bowls, 2 saucers, and a small pitcher with a crack so fine it looked like a drawing of a river. I asked if they would take a display on long-term loan. "With a card that names the hands that use them," I said. The director smiled in the direction of my mother without needing to know her. "We have a case that faces the window," she said. "A lot of kids press their noses there." We arranged labels. Evelyn Harlow, Soup and Tide. Donor, Ava Harlow. I watched Ava read her own name as if it belonged to someone she might want to become. At home, I wrote a check to the library's programming fund and tore up an apology I had started to draft out of habit. Mackie called to say the California AG had opened an inquiry and that Seaward's registered agent had already filed an update that smelled like panic. "Keep your head low and your paperwork high," she said, "and sleep." The next morning, we sat at my kitchen table with the envelope I had left on Brent's table, now returned to me like a message found in a bottle. Ava traced the folded edge. "I wasn't ready that night," she said. "I thought if I opened this, I'd owe you an answer." I told her a letter can be a bench, not a contract. She opened it and read. No tears, no grand gesture. She folded it and slid it back across the wood. "Thank you," she said. The words passed through the room and took a seat where we could both see them. We talked about restitution. She wanted to wire me the money she had gotten from the porcelain sale years ago, plus interest calculated by an app that had taught her more math than school did. I told her to keep her money and give her time. 500 hours, I said, STEM mentoring for kids who think the ocean is only a postcard. She straightened in her chair as if the assignment had put a weight on her shoulders that fit. "I can do that," she said. "Do it even if I never sit in the room," I said. "Do it because you said you will." The doorbell brought a small ring box from the antique circuit. The last bowl, the one whose glaze sang when a spoon touched it. I held it and felt a noise move through my bones I hadn't heard in 20 years. We took it to the library that afternoon. The director cleared a space while a group of 5th graders argued over a knot-tying book. Ava set the bowl into the case with the careful hands of a person learning to restore what cannot be replaced, only honored. The card beneath read, "Used for soup on cold nights, also for telling the truth." Back at the dock on Sunday, I walked Ava through the temperature graph coming off a low-cost sensor off Alki. We watched the line rise and fall with the tide and the sun and the caprice of cloud. "Data has moods," I said. "So do people. The trick is not to confuse one for the other." She smiled in a way that didn't perform anything, and I realized how long it had been since I'd seen that on her face. A gull made off with a boy's sandwich down the pier, and the sound of his outrage lifted the whole afternoon. In the evening, an email from Lila arrived, short, no perfume of strategy. "I'm sorry I chose quiet over truth," she wrote. "It felt like kindness until it didn't." I started 3 responses and deleted all of them. Apologies deserve the courtesy of being read without expecting work back. I filed it in a folder named after, a word I finally believed in. Ava texted, "Sundays at 5?" I typed, "Yes. Bring stories, not plans." The reply came back as one word that felt like new lumber underfoot. Deal. I poured chowder into the newly returned bowl and ate standing at the sink like a dockhand. The spoon made that thin song I had been trying to remember, a sound like metal agreeing with heat. Out the window, the bay wore the last light the way a man wears a coat he has carried a long time. The day did not glow. It held. News never lands all at once. It arrives like tide, first the slick on the rocks, then the lift under the hull. The California AG posted a notice. Seaward's authorization suspended pending inquiry. A week later came the phrase that reads like a gavel without sound, consent dissolution. Brent's quotes to the paper were ironed flat, all about misunderstandings and overcompliance. The order that mattered lived in smaller print. 7-year prohibition from serving as an officer or director of a charitable organization, with restitution calculated by a number that finally put commas where they belonged. Assets I had seen from party windows, an extra parcel outside St. Helena, a flat in the city someone else decorated, became numbers moving toward a fund for the people Seward had promised and not delivered. The thermometer in my memory slid back to 0 and then off the wall. Leo sent a short note with a forwarding address and an employment announcement that did not pose. He had left the firm and signed on with a media ethics nonprofit that trains high school journalists to keep receipts and ask questions with square shoulders. No references needed, he wrote. They hired the version of me I'm trying to become. He and Ava postponed the wedding with a sentence that sounded like work. We're going to therapy. I breathed easier reading that sentence than I ever would have reading a new date. Lila sold the guest house and moved into a smaller place closer to town. A second letter arrived, written in a hand I remembered from grocery lists and permission slips. I am learning that peace built on omission does not weather, she wrote. If Ava wants me at those Sunday calls, I'll be there. If not, I'll be here. It is one thing to read regret, it is another to feel a life reframe itself without fanfare. I put the letter beside the first and did not add a verdict. Not everything requires one. The scholarship board met in a room with folding chairs and a whiteboard that still smelled of solvent. We approved the first cohort, 12 students across Seattle, Monterey, and Biloxi, some with grades as straight as sail luffs. Some with transcripts that wobbled like a skiff in chop, but carried statements that read like the truth. The board chair, a marine chemist with laugh lines cut deep from fieldwork, read the names aloud like weather reports. We signed award letters and then sat back in the quiet that follows the sound of good paper. I walked home through drizzle that never quite took itself seriously and thought about the vocabulary of boats, keel, strake, chine, and how scholarship has its own, governance, compliance, audit, and how both are ways of saying the same thing, hold. A week later, we stood at the Maritime Community Library while a group of kids in puffer jackets pressed their noses to the display case. The porcelain shone under the lights without showing off. The card with my mother's name did the work that cards do when they're written with care. A boy asked if the crack in the picture made it weaker or stronger. Both, I said. It's honest now. He nodded like someone who recognized a kindred object. The director handed Ava a clipboard for volunteer shifts. She signed up for Tuesday afternoons, teaching students how to read tide tables and log entries without erasing their mistakes. Our Sunday settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected to trust. At 5, I set the kettle on and answered when the phone rang without flinching. We talked about weather first because weather is truth that doesn't argue. We traded small stories that did not audition for larger roles. A gull stealing a sandwich, a sensor ping that turned out to be a crab, a community college kid who had never been on the water until a field trip knocked his world 2 degrees toward something possible. Sometimes Leo said hello from the background, and the hellos sounded like a man deciding to speak only when he had something he would stand by. We drew a boundary so obvious it didn't need to be defended. No money talk, no tech talk masquerading as money talk, no gossip that tried to put makeup on cruelty. When one of us slipped, the other shifted the subject without penalties. In April, we took a class onto the pier to drop a sensor package I had refurbished until it looked new. One of the girls, hands steady, eyes steady, asked how heavy the ocean felt at the bottom. Heavy enough to make promises matter, I said. The class wrote numbers on waterproof paper and laughed when the wind did what wind does to paper. Ava stood a pace behind them and watched the joy clean them from the inside out. For a long minute, the past retreated enough to let the syllables of the present stand without wobbling. At night, when the tide pulled the moon like a bead on a string, I wrote in the journal, not every night, I am old enough to have lost interest in perfect streaks. I wrote about the people who had carried me without making a story of it. Ray with his diagrams, Mackie with her square hands, the deputy DA with patience and hellfire placed in the correct order. I wrote about Lila's second letter and how the word sorry can be a tool or a rug. I wrote about Brent only enough to remember not to forget. Men like him rely on your exhaustion. You cannot let them have it. The bowl, the one that sings, lives on a simple plate rail above the stove. I use it when the wind says use it and leave it alone when the day requires something sturdier. Objects do not absolve or accuse, they witness. If I have learned anything from metal and porcelain, it is that maintenance is a love language with calluses. You don't fix what isn't broken, and you don't ignore hairline fractures because they are small. You note them, you check them, you tell the people who use the thing how to use it kindly. One evening, Ava asked if she could bring Lila to the library after hours. I said yes and made myself scarce. Later, the director texted a photo of two women standing before the case, hands not quite touching the glass, faces not quite crying. No caption. Some images declined to be explained. I saved it and put the phone down and sat with the quiet. The room had the dignity of a harbor at slackwater, the world suspended between pulls. That is what outcome feels like when you don't rush it. Not victory, not defeat, but a balance you can walk across if you place your feet with care. If there is a lesson, it is not the kind that fits on a coaster or a nonprofit's annual report. It is older and smaller. Money does not buy a voice that has chosen silence. It buys chairs, cameras, a rented warmth that takes the edge off December. It pays accountants who teach numbers to behave. It does not teach your daughter to say your name. For that, you need time, truth, and an absence of bargaining chips. I keep thinking of bridges. Not the postcard kind, but the working ones with rust in the seams and paint that needs a man in a harness to believe in it. You don't span a river with feelings. You span it with plans, steel, rivets, and inspections. You walk across it with humility because the water does not care whether you make it. When I told a room I would not pour into a leak, I wasn't making a point. I was choosing a bridge that could hold the load I meant to send over it. The scholarship isn't salvation, it's a span. People still have to cross on their own legs. Forgiveness is a word that has gone bankrupt from overuse, but it still spins if you hand it the right way. I thought it would feel like music swelling. It felt like maintenance. You loosen the bolt of your certainty a quarter turn. You grease what squeaks. You stop kicking the same dent and call it healing. When Ava switched off her phone on the pier, that click traveled through my bones like a keel settling into water. I didn't forgive her. I stopped penalizing her. There's a difference, and the difference is mercy. I said an empty place at Christmas and did not explain it. People think the absence is for the dead. It is not. It is for the living who are still finding their way back to the table. The bowl sits above the stove, but I laid a plain plate down and let it mean what it meant, that some seats are promises rather than furniture. Quiet can be a dare or a welcome. I try to make mine the second. Sometimes when the bay is slick as poured lead, I take second chance out alone and drift beyond the ferry lanes. The city looks like an arrangement somebody forgot to dust. I kill the engine and listen to the noise that isn't noise, water grumbling against aluminum, a line ticking a stanchion, a gull making up its mind. I talk out loud to the empty boat because it is easier than praying and more honest than speeches. Hold, I say, and the boat holds because holding is what it was built to do. Ava still calls at 5 on Sundays. We still begin with weather. She tells me a story about a kid who left the library with a tide chart folded into his back pocket like contraband. I tell her about a cracked fitting I replaced before it failed. We make a rule and keep it. We don't use nouns like apology and closure until the verbs have done their time. When Leo's voice floats in from the other room, it no longer sounds like someone auditioning for absolution. It sounds like a man carrying chairs after a meeting because they need carrying. The world around us returns to its practical shape. Brent's name slips to the back pages where it belongs. Lila buys a kettle that whistles and texts a photo of steam. Ray tells me a dumb joke about a seal in a traffic cone. Mackie sends a postcard from a vacation she earned the hard way. 2 lines about a beach with no Wi-Fi and a stack of books. The deputy DA forwards a public docket entry with no commentary because none is required. Outcomes are not morals. They are weather reports that tell you whether to wear boots. I write less in the journal and more on scraps that end up taped to the fridge, clean filters before inspection. Call Biloxi School about field day. Ship sensor housings by Wednesday. The scraps comfort me because they demand tasks, not moods. On the back of one, I find a sentence I don't remember writing. Love is a maintenance schedule for a structure you refuse to abandon. It's a little precious, but the bones are right. I have learned to leave some things unsolved on purpose. The crack in the picture is still a crack. The ledger's gap is still a hole with a damp ring. A decade's silence cannot be invoiced or refunded. If you try to make life pay you back, you will become a collector instead of a father. I would rather be a man who keeps an eye on slack in a line and knows when to take it up. On the longest day of the year, Ava and I eat chowder on the dock out of paper cups because the bowl belongs at the library now. Sunset takes its time like a good mechanic. "Do you ever miss the noise?" she asks, meaning the noise that came with growth, sales, headlines. "Sometimes," I say, "enough to remember I don't need it." She nods and we stop performing the moment and let it be itself. A ferry leans on its horn for some reason we'll never learn, and the sound makes the gulls rearrange the sky. When she leaves, we don't hug as if to certify progress. We touch shoulders like workers clocking off the same shift. I watch her walk up the ramp into light that will last a while yet. Then I set my cup down and untie the line and push the bow with my palm. The boat moves because boats do when asked. Out beyond the breakwater, the chop makes a soft clatter under the hull. I say the only prayer I know that doesn't ask for anything. "Hold!" I say to the cleat, the rope, the span of water, the family we're trying to cross, the truth we laid down like planks. And for once, everything does. In the end, what lasts isn't the noise, the toasts, the cameras, the applause, but the work that happens after the room empties. When the lights go down, a different kind of truth steps forward, the kind that doesn't need a microphone. It sounds like water shouldering along a hole, or a kettle taking its time to boil, or two people choosing weather as their first safe topic because weather never lies. That's where restoration begins. Not in grand gestures, but in ordinary, repeatable acts that honor what is fragile without pretending it is unbreakable. We learn to keep faith with small rituals, showing up on time, keeping records straight, returning calls, telling the same story the same way even when no one is there to check our math. To live like that is to accept that dignity lives in maintenance. There is a difference between buying peace and making it. Money can rent a glow that looks a lot like belonging and hide the draft under a door for a season, but it cannot teach a voice to say your name. Belonging requires upkeep, the quiet disciplines practiced when no audience is watching. We show up at the same hour each week. We listen without sharpening a counter-argument. We carry our share of chairs at the end of the meeting. We stop paying interest on old injuries. In that sense, love is a schedule more than it is a feeling. Care written down, honored, and repeated until it becomes part of the floor we walk on. Truth is the tool that makes upkeep possible. Not a weapon to win a scene, not a slogan that flatters our side of the story, but a measuring tape that doesn't care whose hands are holding it. Truth alone will not repair a break, but it will let the wound drain so healing has a clean place to start. It asks simple, stubborn questions. Who signed? Who witnessed? Who benefited? And also the gentler ones. Who is ready to move forward without pretending the past didn't happen? A life that welcomes those questions trades spectacle for clarity. It learns to be boring in the ways that keep people safe. Forgiveness, when it finally arrives, rarely feels like music swelling. It feels like upkeep as well. We loosen the bolt of certainty a quarter turn. We grease what squeaks. We stop kicking the same dent. We decide to stop charging compound interest on someone else's worst day. Forgiveness is not the same as trust, and it is not permission for harm to continue. It is a refusal to let harm decide the shape of tomorrow. It keeps a chair open without insisting anyone sit in it before they are ready. It knows that amends have verbs before they earn nouns. Outcomes, like weather, are not morals, they are conditions. A court can redistribute funds, dissolve an organization, or bar someone from a title, but it cannot write a new heart. Paper can carry weight, it cannot carry meaning for us. That part is on us. To choose what we build next, to use resources in ways that create ladders rather than traps, to plant long projects that will not applaud us but will outlive us. A scholarship, a steady mentorship shift, a careful report that no one outside the room will read. These are not headlines, but they are scaffolds you can trust. They turn money from a spotlight into a light switch and teach it to serve. There is a ritual as old as hospitality, leaving an empty place at the table. It can honor the lost, but it can also welcome the living who are still on the long road back. An empty plate is not a guilt trip. It is a promise that a chair will be kept warm without a bill attached. When we set that place in our homes or our habits, we remind ourselves that reconciliation is a path, not a performance, and that pace matters as much as direction. Some evenings, the chair will be filled. Other evenings, it will stay quietly waiting. Both can be holy. None of this requires perfection. In fact, perfection will ruin it. The bowl with the hairline crack still sings when a spoon taps its rim. It might even sing truer. The ledger with a gap becomes a caution rather than a curse when we refuse to pretend the gap is normal. And the bridge that grows a patchwork of paint and rivets is, in its way, more trustworthy than the one that stays glossy by staying unused. We are not after flawless. We are after faithful. Faithfulness survives the weather because it expects the weather. So here's the quiet creed this story leaves behind. Choose truth before optics. Choose upkeep over spectacle. Choose bridges you can inspect over shortcuts that demand secrecy. Speak plainly when the moment asks for it, and fall silent when silence is the kinder sentence. Invest in what will hold when applause stops. Keep rules you can follow on your worst day. Let apologies be verbs first, nouns later. Let money be a tool, not a leash. Honor the work that makes belonging possible. Showing up, keeping records, asking better questions, and making space for people to return without humiliation. Build things that will still be standing when no one remembers who cut the ribbon. And when you run out of the right words, there is one prayer that asks nothing and gives enough. Hold. Hold in the storm and in the slack water. Hold when the river rises and when the air goes still. Hold the line you said you would hold, the rope, the promise, the boundary, the bridge, and let time do what time does with steady hands nearby. Some nights, everything will. Some nights it won't. Either way, you become the kind of person who can be trusted with weight. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story met you somewhere you didn't expect, if it pressed on a bruise or eased a fear or simply reminded you of the dignity in quiet work, tell us about it. We'd love to hear what part stayed with you and why. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. Your words help this community practice the same maintenance we've been talking about. If a particular moment struck you, leave the timestamp so others can find it too. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Bring a friend next time. Bring your questions. Bring your own hard-won wisdom. Above all, bring your honest voice. Stories like this don't end. They continue in the lives of people who choose to hold. As you reflect, consider sharing one small practice you'll try this week. A call you've been delaying, a boundary you'll set kindly, a report you'll finally publish. Your ideas help others build their own bridges. We read every comment, and we're grateful you're here doing the patient, ordinary work that makes extraordinary lives possible.